Hi, this is Justin Colletti of Sonic Scoop, and today, thanks to our friends over at JZ Microphones, we're going to have some fun listening to a variety of mics and taking a bit of a tour of some of the most classic, iconic, useful, and arguably best-sounding microphones in the history of the world. And the lens through which we're going to be doing that is the JZ Vintage series of microphones. I am right now talking into a JZ V67. This Vintage 67 microphone is one that I've used on a whole lot of podcast episodes, a whole bunch of videos that I've done. But I have not only this mic here, the V67, but I have from their Vintage series, the V47, and I also have, this one is a V12, and there's also over here a V11. So I've got a whole bunch of mics for us to try out. We're going to hear them not only on my voice, but also on drums and acoustic guitar. And I think we're going to really hear the differences in the whole series. And while we do so, I think you're going to get a feel for how some of the most iconic styles of microphones in history compare to one another. And these broad families of microphones that JZ has been inspired by in the Vintage series continue to endure and be popular for good reason. In case you're not familiar with any of those numbers that I threw out there, we're going to go through all of them today. Right now I'm talking into the V67, and this one is inspired by the Neumann U67 style of microphone. And I want to hear this along with you compared to the V47, which I've got right here. They look practically identical. They have the same chassis, the same visual aesthetic design. On each of them is written their model name, but each of them has a slightly different sound, and we're going to hear all of them. Again, not only on my voice, but also on the guitar and drums coming up. I'm going to put my headphones on for this so I can hear them with you in real time. And this here is the sound of the V67 microphone. And I'll also bring up their frequency response charts as well. And in addition to these frequency response charts, I also have this fun little graph from JZ where they try to categorize all of their mics here on a spectrum, with the V67 being a little bit darker maybe than your average condenser microphone, but a bit brighter than both the V47 and the V11, which we'll hear coming up. Speaking of which, let's switch over right now from this V67 and now over to the V47. And I'll also pull up its frequency response chart. And you can actually see that the frequency response charts for both these microphones, the 47 and the 67, look pretty darn similar. But there is a difference in character. Both of them seem to have this little bit of enhancement in the low end from about 50 to 100 hertz, a bit of a boost there, a little bit of a dip down in the low mids, and then a little bit of a lift from 2K on up around a 6K or 7K, followed by a high frequency roll-off. And this is the sound of the Vintage 47 microphone from JZ, which is inspired by the classic Neumann U47s. And here again is that Vintage 67, inspired by the classic Neumann U67s. Both originally tube microphones. These are solid-state designs, and they go for remarkably less than a high-end new Neumann microphone today. The U67 was basically the precursor to the U87, which is still one of the most popular high-end microphones being sold to this day, while the Neumann U47 was the precursor to the U67 microphone, and a little bit richer and thicker. And although the frequency response graphs look pretty close to identical on these two microphones, I do feel that this 47 is a little bit fatter, a little bit thicker, a little bit richer, whereas I'm getting the tiniest bit of extra detail and presence out of the 67. Both of these are great all-around microphones, and I would say that the 47s are really favored by a lot of people for things like male vocals. Now, let's do a magic finger snap, and I will make this Vintage 67 magically transform into a V12. Oh my goodness, it totally worked. What movie-making magic. We've totally increased our budget for special effects here on the channel. Although you can't see a difference because most of the mics in this series look basically identical, probably can hear a difference because now you're hearing the V12. And the V12 is inspired by legendary, iconic AKG C12 style of microphone, which are generally a lot brighter and have a lot more kind of sparkle and shimmer on top than the Neumanns, like the 67 and the 47. Comparing this to the 47, you hear a little bit more of a pillowy, smooth, silky top end. And then over on the V12, all of a sudden the veil is kind of lifted from the top end, and you get this extra clarity, this extra detail in the high highs. And bringing up the frequency response chart for this microphone, you see something very different. The low frequencies are really flat, so even when I get really close on this microphone, you don't hear a lot of kind of bloom and boom out of it. It stays really clean and tight. Whereas when I get really up on this vintage 47, we're starting to get some real thickness and extra bottom end out of it. Whereas here, a little tighter and cleaner. But there's also a little bit of a dip in the upper mid-range around 2 or 3K, and then a lift that starts around 4K and keeps on going and gets higher and higher and higher until it really peaks out around 8, 9, 10K. And then the super high frequency roll-off is much lower. We're still boosted up around 11K and 12K with a much more subtle and high up roll-off compared to something like this vintage 47, where there's almost the inverse. There's a little bit of a upper mid-range boost and then a real roll-off here in the top end, making it a little bit silkier, a little smoother, a little fuller. So those are the three main mics in the series, really inspired by classics. 2 from Neumann, U47 and the U67, and 1 inspired by AKG, the V12. I'd say this chart that Jay-Z sent over is fairly accurate, with the V47 being the darkest of those three, and the V67 adding a little bit more presence, and the V12 being considerably brighter with a little bit more sparkle on top and a little bit more tightness in bottom and just a little bit of a lighter, brighter, clearer overall tone. But there's also one more microphone in this series which looks different than the others, the V11. And this one is a unique design from Jay-Z, and it's meant to be the darkest and smoothest of the lot. But I'll tell you, I don't really know if to my ears it's darker sounding than the V47. It sounds dark in a different way. And now let's do one more comparison with one more magic finger snap here. Can you believe it? It worked again. And now we are listening to the sound of the V11 microphone from Jay-Z. And this one has a significantly different looking frequency response chart, and I think you can hear it sounds fairly different from the 47. Both of these are dark and smooth, but in different ways. If we look at the frequency response chart for the 47, you see that there is a little bit of an upper mid-range boost and then a fairly significant top-end roll-off with a little bit of a lift in the bottom end. But when I go over to the V11, this one has a little bit of a different approach. It does have an extra bit of boost and lift from about 50 hertz to 100 hertz, and it has this kind of little bit of mid-range forward thing going on where 2K is brought forward a little bit with a little bit of a dip from 3 to 5K, which is usually a slightly edgier area of the upper mid-range. And then above that, we have the ever tiniest lift up above 5K, and then the roll-off here happens much higher up. So on something like the vintage 47, we have a little bit more upper mid-range presence with a little bit more extreme high frequency roll-off. Whereas in the vintage 11, we've got the inverse, where we have a little bit less of the upper mid-range push and a little bit more of the extended high frequency. So each of these is fairly dark and smooth and rich, but in its own unique way. And to me, this V11 does sound a little bit more modern. It is smooth and dark, but not with that kind of old school veiled top end, and also really nice overall character. Just for a little bit more contrast, one more back-to-back comparison, one more magic finger snap, we'll listen to the V11 next to the V67. And again, although you can't really see it, that V47 has magically changed into a V67 with just a little bit more brightness and detail than the V47. And now we'll compare that to the V12, which is smoother, a little bit less presence and articulation on the very top end, but with just enough of a mid-range accent to give it some intelligibility. So also a really nice sounding microphone. Which of these mics should you go with? Man, well, if I could only have one mic in the studio, out of all of them, I think the Vintage 67 really hits a nice balance where it's full-bodied, but also has a little bit of articulation. But if you already have a relatively kind of bright and forward-sounding microphone and you want something a little bit darker and smoother, then yeah, either that Vintage 47 or that V11 could do really nicely for you, with the V47 having a little bit more of a kind of old school flavor with a slightly veiled and softened top end, and with the V11 having a smooth, silky thing going on, but with just a little bit more of the high frequency still left behind. It kind of lifts the veil a little bit on highs. But if you already have some dark, robust sounding microphones, then that V12, which is really going to bring out your top end more, man, that can be a good way to go. And any one of these microphones can really excel on a variety of sources. You'll hear of people using things like U67s for drum overheads and acoustic guitar, but you'll also hear people using things like AKG C12s for overheads and acoustic guitar. It depends on what you want. A little bit more body, a little bit more girth, something like the U67, V67 would work. A little bit more sparkle, a little bit of a tighter sound with a little bit more top end extension than something like the C12 or V12 could really work nicely. A lot of people favor something like the U47 or V47 for things like drum room mics or male vocals that want a little bit of extra girth and body. Putting those things on bass cabs as well can make a lot of sense. And this V11 is really its own thing where it's giving you this kind of smoothness for sounds that you don't want super featured and just want to take the edge off of sounds that are a little bit too bright without totally reshaping them and radically skewing their frequency response. So it could be a nice way to soften things and let them sit back in the mix slightly more while we're still retaining a somewhat modern and clear sound. All right, you can tell I only have 2 channels available because I'm doing mostly mastering these days, so I have no need for a lot of inputs except when I'm demoing mics. But now we are experimenting with the 2 brighter sounding microphones. This is the V12 from Jay-Z, inspired after that AKG C12, and here is the V67. So both of these have a certain bit of brightness to them, a little bit more than both the 47 and the 11. But to me, this 67 has a little bit more of an upper mid-range push and a little bit more of a kind of supple, creamy bottom end. Whereas when we go over to this V12, you hear a little bit more extended brightness on top, a little bit more sizzle, a little bit more sparkle, and a little bit of a tighter bottom. When I get really close on the mic, you don't really hear as much kind of boom and chest coming out of it. It's just a little bit cleaner and tighter down there. Now that we've heard these all on my voice, I think it's time to hear them on some additional sources. So we mic'd up some drums and an acoustic guitar with these. Big thanks to Chris Swiss for playing drums for this, and big thanks to David Ross for playing the guitar. We were doing a session where we went through some mic techniques for recording acoustic guitar and for recording drums. You can check those out in detail. I used only Jay-Z microphones on those. Big thanks to those guys for sending us a whole bunch of those microphones to try out. I tried to position all the capsules so close together that they're basically touching. That said, even moving a microphone by an inch or two can lead to subtle variations in tone, so we may hear some slight positioning differences as well as slight tonal differences between the mics. That said, with how close they are together and how far away we are from the source, I think any differences in mic positioning should be pretty minimal, and we should be hearing mostly the difference in sound between each of these mics. So put on some good headphones or fire up some good speakers if you haven't already, and let's hear through those 2 sources right now together. All right, so you've just heard each of these microphones on voice, on drums, on acoustic guitar. What was your favorite in each of those applications? Do you already own one of these microphones? If so, what have you been loving using it on? I want to hear about it in the comments down below. Definitely let us know what you think. Right now, I'm speaking through the V67, which I think is a really nice happy medium between the fullness and thickness of the 47 and the brightness and articulation of that C12 V12 style of microphone. But I think with each and every one of these mics, it's kind of one of those can't miss kind of things where there's a lot of studios that have original U67s, U47s, C12s where they'll use that microphone on pretty much everything in the session. And you don't really need to change microphones and they just kind of sound good on practically everything. And that's what these JZ microphones are kind of like as well. A lot of them can be a use-it-anywhere microphone that gives you a decent amount of character, but not a character that becomes overbearing or potentially becomes an issue when you stack or layer them on top of each other. So I definitely recommend trying them out for yourself. If you want to get super big deals on these, they might go on sale once or twice throughout the year. If you want to know about that when that does happen, go over to sonicscoop.com and sign up for our newsletter. You'll see a newsletter sign up right on the top right-hand side of your screen, and we'll alert you the next time these guys do go on sale. Well, thanks for hanging out with me. I hope you enjoyed this tour of the vintage series from JZ Microphones. Big thanks again to the guys from JZ for sending these microphones over for us to play around with. Thanks to you for hanging out with us. This has been Justin Colletti of Sonic Scoop. See you next time.